Welcome to the deep dive. We're plunging into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. It's all based on these classic popular philosophy essays you shared with us.
Yeah, and they're not just, dusty old texts. They really grab you by the collar, make you question some fundamental things you think you know about yourself, about the world.
Absolutely. So think of this deep dive as our mission, really. But we want to pull out the core insights from these sources for you. We're talking huge questions here, like how do our beliefs actually take shape?
Right. Or what makes life worth living? What even is truth? Rationality.
And the big one, are our choices actually free? Or is it all kind of predetermined?
And why do you, the individual, matter in all this?
We'll be your guides, sort of navigating these ideas.
And showing how these essays, even though they're older, offer some, well, surprisingly fresh takes, challenging perspectives, even now.
Okay, let's dive in. The first big idea. It really flips conventional thinking, doesn't it?
It does. The source starts right off suggesting that our deepest convictions, our gut feelings, desires, our passional and volitional nature, as the text puts it,
Right.
might be just as important in forming beliefs as, like, pure intellect.
Which is not how we usually think about it.
Not at all. And it immediately brings up this idea of options for belief. And crucially, it says they aren't all the same. They have categories.
Okay.
Live or dead, forced or trivial, momentous or, well, not momentous.
Can you break those down a bit? Keep it simple.
Sure. A live option is one you actually have some tendency to believe or could act on. Like if I suggested you become a Buddhist monk tomorrow, for most people listening, probably a dead option. No real pull there.
Right. Makes sense.
A forced option, that's one you can't avoid choosing. Like either accept this truth or don't, sitting on the fence is still a choice with consequences.
Okay.
A trivial option you can avoid. And momentous. That's unique, high stakes, maybe irreversible. Big deal.
Got it. And the sources bring up Pascal's wager, don't they?
Yeah.
It's this classic example of a forced, momentous option for believing in God.
Exactly. The logic being, potential infinite gain versus potentially losing.
Right.
Well, not much, comparatively. Intellect alone might push you towards belief just based on those odds.
But the source adds a layer there, right?
Yeah.
About it needing to be live.
Yes. A really crucial layer. Pascal's logic, when you apply it to specifics like, say, Catholic rituals, masses, holy water, well, the source says that wouldn't work for maybe a Muslim of Pascal's time because that specific hypothesis is dead for them.
Oh, okay.
They just have no inclination to act on that. So for an option to be truly live, it has to connect with your existing tendencies, your inner setup.
This immediately clashes with that really strong counter-argument from W.K. Clifford.
Oh, yeah. Clifford's view is stark.
He basically says it's wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Full stop.
It's a moral issue for him, like building a ship you haven't checked properly, believing without proof, irresponsible, dangerous even.
And that feels very, well, rational, especially for science, or just making everyday decisions.
It does, but the source pushes back. It argues that sometimes, especially in those forced momentous options we talked about,
Yeah.
the risk of losing a potential truth might actually be worse than the risk of believing something false.
Ah, okay. This is where that mountain climbing analogy fits in. It's quite vivid.
Yeah, exactly. You're facing this chasm, this leap you might not make. Intellect makes you doubt, hesitate, but hesitating indefinitely is a choice. You lose your chance of safety just as surely as if you'd jumped and failed.
So inaction guarantees failure in that case.
Sometimes, yes. Not choosing is the choice that seals your fate.
Okay.
And building on that, the source introduces this really interesting idea that faith itself can sometimes, well, make itself true, bring about its own verification.
How does that work? That sounds a bit circular.
Well, think about it in practical terms. Governments, armies, stock markets, colleges, even sports teams, they all depend fundamentally on what the source calls a precursive faith in one another.
You mean?
Meaning people have to believe the currency is stable, believe their comrades are loyal, believe the degree is valuable, believe their teammates will play their part.
Right.
Without that initial act of belief, that trust, the whole system wouldn't even get going. So your faith isn't just passive, it's an active ingredient. It helps make the thing you believe in work.
And so, in a way, it verifies itself.
Exactly. Your belief helps create the reality that proves your belief was, well, warranted.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So belief isn't always the end point after all the evidence is in. Sometimes it has to come first.
Precisely. Now let's take this idea. Forced, momentous options and apply it directly to what the source calls the religious hypothesis.
Yep.
As defined here, it's basically two claims. One, the best things are eternal, lasting.
Okay.
And two, we're better off believing this now.
Why is that considered a forced option, though? Can't you just wait and see, be skeptical?
Well, the argument is you can't really escape the consequences by being neutral. If religion in this sense is true, then by holding back, waiting forever for absolute proof, you lose out on the good it promises. Just as much as if you actively decided not to believe. The analogy used is like hesitating forever to ask someone to marry you because you're not 100% sure.
Right, you miss the chance entirely through inaction.
Exactly. You cut yourself off from the possibility.
It feels like you have to engage with it somehow.
Yes, and the source touches on that feeling that maybe you need to meet the hypothesis halfway. It compares it to being in a social situation. If you demand absolute proof for every polite remark someone makes.
You'd seem pretty weird. Churlish, as the source says.
Right. And you'd probably cut yourself off from making real connections. The suggestion is maybe a similar dynamic exists with certain big ideas, including religious ones. Evidence might not just appear unless you show some willingness to engage.
So the argument really comes together here. In these specific situations, forced, momentous, where pure logic isn't enough, it can actually be rational, or at least justifiable, to choose to believe.
To believe, at our own risk, as the source puts it, any hypothesis that is love enough to tempt our will.
As long as it doesn't clash with other things you know are true.
Right. Provided it doesn't contradict other established truths. The source kind of mocks the idea of only waiting for intellect and senses in these cases, calls it clinging to the queerest idol ever manufactured in the philosophic cave.
Strong words.
Yeah. It argues, look, no little bell rings inside us when we hit absolute truth. We know that. So waiting for one before we act, especially when we have to act, seems unrealistic. We risk error either way, believing or not believing.
Okay, this connects directly to another huge question the sources get into. Is life itself actually worth living?
Yeah, a fundamental one. And the sources look at it through different temperaments. You've got the inherent optimist, like Walt Whitman is used as an example. Just this affirmation of life's goodness, despite everything.
And then the flip side.
Yeah.
The deep pessimist. Like James Thompson's poetry, or Carlyle talking about the everlasting no. Seeing life as just this struggle, this devouring monster.
And a big reason for that pessimism, or at least a challenge to simple optimism, is all this suffering and evil we see. That really complicates what the source calls natural religion, just worshiping nature as it is. How do you worship a system that includes so much pain?
That's often the entry point for higher religions, isn't it? The idea that this visible world is maybe not the whole story.
Exactly. That visible nature must be but a veil, and the real meaning is somewhere else, in an unseen or other world. Gives a different framework.
The source also looks at the scientific perspective, right? Positivism.
Yeah, scientific positivism. The approach that tries to stick strictly to tangible facts, observable stuff, sometimes treating science almost like an idol, the only way to truth.
But there's a counter-argument there, too.
Yes. The source points out that even science isn't purely objective. It's driven by our own imperious inner demands, our need for order, harmony, simplicity.
So our inner lives, our interests, they aren't just filters to be ignored.
No, they actively shape what science looks for and how it interprets the world. They aren't irrelevant.
There's a really striking point linking our feeling of certainty, whether about God or just about things working out to our will to live.
Right. The source suggests that losing that inner assurance, that belief in some kind of positive outcome or meaning, can genuinely extinguish the desire to live for some people. It can lead straight to suicidal thoughts.
Wow.
And then comes this really mind-bending idea.
Okay.
Could the existence of that unseen world actually depend partly on us, on our response? Could God, as the source provocatively asks, draw vital strength and increase of very being from our fidelity?
Whoa. So our faith isn't just reacting to something, it might be helping create it.
Yeah.
Or sustain it.
That's the suggestion. It flips the whole script.
So optimism and pessimism, they aren't just descriptions, they're actions, definitions.
Exactly. The source argues they are active definitions of the world. And our own small responses, our beliefs, our actions, they're integral parts that necessarily help to determine the definition.
How can something small make such a big difference?
It uses these great analogies, like a huge balanced rock being tipped over by just a feather's weight if it lands in the perfect spot.
Or the word not completely reversing the meaning of a whole sentence.
Yeah. our seemingly tiny choices or beliefs can fundamentally alter the meaning or outcome of the whole picture.
That naturally leads to thinking about rationality itself. What makes something feel rational?
The source suggests it's often about feelings, feelings of ease, peace, rest, or the satisfaction of unifying things, putting them in neat categories, finding patterns.
Makes sense. But it also talks about the limits of that kind of rationality, right? The theoretic kind.
Yes, the kind focused just on understanding, explaining. Science is amazing at explaining how things work, finding causes, but it always leaves some things as just brute facts, unexplained givens.
Like the example of suffocation.
Right. Science can explain it involves lack of oxygen, but that doesn't explain the feeling of suffocation or why lacking oxygen has that specific horrible effect. There's always a remainder, something that just is.
So there's another kind of rationality.
Yeah, practical rationality. Thought aimed at guiding action. The source argues our intellect is largely built on practical interests. Thinking is often just a step towards doing something. Cognition as a guide to appropriate action.
Like the reflex action idea. Sense something, think about it, act.
Exactly. And this connects back to things like theism. The argument is that theistic concepts offer an adequate object for that action stage of the mind. They give our actions a goal, a framework, a sense of purpose, helping the mind function without feeling stuck or aimless.
It even challenges the idea that science is purely objective, doesn't it?
It does. It argues that even bare physics is an alteration and falsification of the world as we experience it. Physics selects certain aspects, mass, motion, and ignores others.
Why?
For its own purpose. Achieving simplicity, making predictions, it's driven by a goal.
Just like religious frameworks might select other aspects for their purpose.
Precisely. Like finding meaning or an adequate object for our actions. Both, in this view, are human ways of shaping reality, driven by different but equally valid human purposes. Neither is just a perfect mirror of reality as it is.
Okay, let's shift to another classic puzzle, the dilemma of determinism.
Ah, yes, the big one. Free will versus everything being fixed.
The source lays it out clearly. Determinism. The universe is set. Only one possible future. What happens had to happen.
Versus indeterminism. Real possibilities exist. Genuine chance. Multiple potential futures.
That word chance often sounds bad, though, like chaos.
Right. Barefaced, crazy unreason, as the source puts it. But it suggests we reframe it. Think of chance not as chaos, but maybe as a free gift, something extra, something not guaranteed by the past, but potentially good, something genuinely new.
And there's that example about choosing which street to walk home.
Yeah, Divinity Avenue or Oxford Street. The point is, after you choose, someone can always look back and say, oh, you had to choose Oxford Street because, and find reasons.
Right. Your mood, habit, whatever.
But the source argues, before you chose. There was no absolute necessity. Either path was genuinely possible. Both would seem equally rational in hindsight. Nothing forced one path over the other beforehand.
This really throws a wrench into things like regret, doesn't it? Moral judgments.
Absolutely. If everything was predetermined, if it had to happen exactly that way, then feeling regret that something ought to have been different seems, well, illogical. Absurd, even.
So determinism implies regrets are mistakes or meaningless.
That's the challenge posed. Determinism might force us to just extinguish regrets or see them as errors in thinking.
So the deep question is the world a place where our choices actually matter before we make them? Where things are genuinely ambiguous?
A place where we're not just actors reading lines, but maybe co-authors of the script? That's the heart of the dilemma.
Okay, shipping slightly again, but related. The source talks about the importance of individuals. Starts with that great Carpenter quote.
Oh yeah, that's a memorable one. There is very little difference between one man and another, but what little there is very important.
Captures it perfectly. And the argument is that little difference. That's where change comes from.
Right. Those individual differences are the causes of social change.
It uses Darwinian ideas here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Variation versus environment.
Exactly. Contrasting spontaneous variation, the unpredictable new things that pop up in individuals, with the environment, which then acts like a filter, selecting, preserving, or destroying those variations.
And this pushes back against theories that say only the environment or big social forces matter.
Yes. It critiques views, like some readings of Spencer or Grant Allen's climate determinism, that downplay individual initiative, that see people as just products of their surroundings.
The omelet analogy comes in here.
Right. The environment provides the necessary conditions. You need eggs for an omelet. You need certain societal conditions for change.
But
But the individual spark, the new idea, the physiological accident leading to genius, that's the sufficient condition. The unpredictable element the environment didn't create, but can only react to.
Like Darwin's 5 fingers. An unimportant trait carried along by an important one.
Yeah, or the different animals in Borneo and New Guinea despite similar climates. Suggests something more than just environment drives diversity.
Or needing a great leader when the time is right. The environment is ready, but the specific person has to emerge.
Exactly. The environment can select, but it can't generate the variation itself. So the conclusion is new ideas, big changes. They often start as random images, fancies, accidental outbursts of spontaneous variation in individual brains. Unpredictable sparks.
And the environment then decides which sparks catch fire.
Pretty much.
Okay, next up, ethics. Can we ever figure out the absolute final ethical truth in advance?
The source argues basically no. Like physics, ethics is always waiting for more data for the last man to have his say, his experience.
So ethical truth is evolving, provisional.
That's the idea. It's not set in stone.
So what's the philosopher's job then, if there's no final answer?
They contribute their own ideals, try to build consistent systems, find harmonies, but they aren't the ultimate judge. The source uses the example of Bunsen, the chemist. Brilliant chemist, but maybe insensible to many goods outside his field.
Like a Bunsen burner in the moral world. Focused, but narrow.
Exactly. Any single person has blind spots. We can't see all possible goods or values.
This brings up obligation. Where
Yeah.
does the ought come from?
The source suggests obligation needs a claimant, someone making the claim on us. In a theistic system, that claimant is God, a divine thinker whose ideal sets the standard.
And without that, in a purely human world, a moral solitude.
Then moral energy might lack its maximal stimulating power. Our ideals might feel more like just our preferences, maybe less binding, less motivating.
What about tough dilemmas, like sacrificing one for many?
The source says there's no pre-written rule book for those unique cases. The right casuistic order, the right way to decide that specific case. We often only figure it out after deciding.
By seeing the results and how they feel.
Yeah, seeing if the outcome resonates, if it feels right or wrong in retrospect. The key idea is these aren't just abstract choices between goods. We're choosing between two total universes, the universe where we did X versus the one where we did Y.
Each choice creates a different reality.
Exactly. And because each situation is unique and defining, ethics has to stay open. Open to new experiences, and maybe even open to metaphysical possibilities, like whether there is a divine claimant.
Okay, finally, the source makes this really intriguing argument for looking at the weird stuff. The unclassified residuum.
Yeah, the irregular phenomena. Things science usually ignores or even scoffs at because they don't fit the current picture.
Why look there?
Because that's where genuinely new knowledge often comes from. Looking at the anomalies, the outliers, is essential for renovating knowledge, shaking things up.
And this includes things people call mystical, occult.
Right. That often falls into this category. The sources mention the work of people like F.W.H. Myers and the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR.
What do they do?
They tried to study these things, hallucinations, hypnotism, mediumship systematically, using scientific methods or trying to...
Like Gurney's census of hallucination.
Exactly, which found evidence for veridical hallucinations, people seeing things that matched real events elsewhere happening more often than pure chance would predict, or investigations into mediums. They even mention a performer, Mr. Davy, who could fake spirit slates perfectly.
Why mention a fraud?
To show how hard it is to detect. If fraud is that convincing, it makes it harder to just dismiss all claims easily. You have to investigate carefully.
And Myers tried to connect these dots.
Yeah, he saw them not as random oddities, but maybe parts of a connected system, hinting at physiological extension or hypernormal cognitions, ways of knowing beyond the usual senses.
But science is usually very skeptical about this stuff.
Extremely. The non-posthumous attitude, it's impossible, therefore it didn't happen.
But the source argues
That the cumulative evidence, even if there's no single decisive thunderbolt proof, well, it chips away at the certainty of the standard view. It subtracts presumptive force from the orthodox belief that everything in our minds has to come from normal senses. It raises questions.
even simpler things like suddenly remembering where you lost your keys.
Or Stephen's story about hearing a warning voice before a shed collapsed, mentioned in the sources. These less dramatic subconscious things might be related part of the same broader spectrum of mental activity beyond conscious control.
So exploring this residuum challenges the edges of what we think is possible.
That's the idea. It pushes the boundaries of the currently accepted order of nature, suggesting maybe it's bigger or stranger than we assume.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot. A real deep dive into some foundational and pretty challenging ideas. We've gone from how our will shapes belief to forced choices in life and religion.
How we define life's worth, the limits of logic, the power of practical reason.
The case for real chance, why individuals matter for change.
The evolving nature of ethics, and this whole fascinating area of phenomena beyond the mainstream.
The big takeaway seems to be that these sources really push you, the listener, to think about your own active role.
Yeah, your role in shaping beliefs, facing uncertainty, making choices. It suggests truth isn't always just out there waiting. Especially in these crucial areas, it might be more plastic, responsive to our efforts, our faith.
So here's a final thought drawing from all this, for you to take away and maybe chew on. If truth itself can be shaped, even partly by our active participation and effort, and if your individual faith and actions can genuinely make a difference, how does that change the way you look at the decisions and uncertainties in your own life?